So ordered.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment prevents funds from this act to be used to implement a Department of the Interior management plan for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which designates the entirety as a wilderness. This would include the 1002 area that was set aside by this Congress for the potential development in the future in an area that holds 10 billion barrels of oil at the minimum and probably 37 trillion cubic feet of natural gas.
Colleague from Alaska. This amendment would block the implementation of the Comprehensive Conservation Plan for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, a plan that will already have been in place for nearly 2 years by the time this language will take effect, and a plan that received broad support upon its implementation. At more than 19 million acres, the Arctic Refuge is one of the crown jewels of our nation's public lands. And like Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon before it, this iconic landscape deserves to be protected for generations to come. Included in the CCP is a recommendation for expanded wilderness designations with nearly 1 million people from all 50 states, including Native, faith-based, business, and conservation groups, having submitted comments in support of it. The Arctic Refuge's coastal plain is the biological heart of the refuge, which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service calls the Center for Wildlife Activity. The plan's current wilderness recommendation would ensure that these pristine habitats will remain intact for future generations. This is critical to supporting native wildlife and maintaining traditional and subsistence activities on the refuge. Since President Eisenhower established the Arctic National Wildlife Range, members of both parties have stood up to protect this truly unique national treasure. Republican Senator William Roth introduced the first bill to designate the refuge's coastal plain as wilderness in 1987. A bill to protect this place as wilderness has been introduced every Congress since, and in this Congress, 128 members from both sides of the aisle have pledged their support. So while I have the utmost respect for my friend and colleague, Mr. Young, I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, may I suggest to the gentleman that this was an act of Congress to set aside the 1002 area by the senator from Washington State. Crucially important, because it is an area that has great potential 74 miles away from the existing pipeline. It also is an area that has the village of Kaktovik that supports the drilling and development in 1002. And I'm just saying that no agency has the right to overcome a law of the Congress. I'm not talking about the 19 million acres. I'm talking about the small acreage, not really the bigger in the Dulles Airport. To allow that to be continued to be considered by the Congress of the United States, who set it aside at the insistence of Scoop Jackson from Washington State with the help of Senator Ted Stevens and myself for potential drilling. It has to have an act of Congress, but you can't drill in a wilderness area. So I'm saying no money shall be spent, no regulatory agency can turn and make it a off-limits area to develop the oil if this Congress so decides. And I urge a yes on my amendment and reserve.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time, I'd like to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady. My friend from Alaska is correct. The ultimate decision on the final disposition of this incredible place is up to the Congress of the United States. However, the question before us now is how should this area be managed until Congress finally resolves this issue. I'm proud to have authored an amendment a few months back that showed that there is bipartisan support in the House for a final wilderness determination. I believe eventually that bipartisan support will be a majority of the Congress. But in the meantime, those of us that are working to protect this very important, iconic place know that we are expressing the voice of the American people. Nearly 1 million people commented in support of the wilderness recommendation. These are people from all 50 states. It includes Native Americans. It includes Native Alaskans. It includes people from the faith community, the business community, the environmental community. This is a uniquely important place with wildlife that in many cases are not found anywhere else, and with a connection for all of us, because the migratory bird species that spend part of their lives in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge traveled almost all 50 states in other parts of their life stage. So we all have a stake in this. We need to do the right thing. I believe the administration is doing the right thing by managing this area as wilderness while we continue to work on an act of Congress that will settle this long-standing question. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
All I can say, Mr. Chairman, is that most people don't know what they're talking about, and we follow the laws of the Congress. We should, and I respectfully suggest that I'm not suggesting the whole, and I'm not supporting it right now, the Arctic Wildlife Range. I'm talking about 100,000 acres of land that we set aside, the Congress. The Senate agreed to it. The conference agreed to it. And here we are trying to let a regulatory agency tell us how to manage it, and that's inappropriate. I listened to the other gentlemen on this floor today talking about overregulation of the EPA. That's what's wrong with this nation today, is regulatory law allowing the executive branch to run this nation without the people's voice being heard. And that's what's happening here. So I suggest respectfully, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've had the opportunity to be up in this area, and this protected area encompasses a wide range of Arctic and subarctic ecosystems. And the native flora and fauna is magnificent. The refuge is incredible with its biological diversity. And I simply understand that the gentleman from Alaska feels strongly about this issue, and in a way that I feel differently about it, and that he has been an advocate for his state for decades. But on this important issue, we just simply disagree. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't point out one more obvious truth. The President will not sign a bill loaded up with anti-environmental riders just like this one. So we only make our path for this bill harder by including it. So I would hope my colleagues would join me in opposing with it. And with that, the gentleman, I believe, has yielded back his time, so I yield back mine as well.
The gentleman yields back the balance of her time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18...
Mr. Chair, I was in the presence of getting up. You weren't looking up. I had asked for a roll call.
Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings of the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska will be postponed.
Thank you, sir.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I rise to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
And I yield to the gentleman from Missouri in order to enter in a colloquy with the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the World War I Centennial Commission. The United States entered World War I in 1917. More than 4 million Americans served in the Great War, including 350,000 African Americans, and the first woman ever to enlist in the United States Armed Forces. And in order to